Sometimes, surprising things happen in important social elections, even in democracies. It's important to remember that the popular vote can change its color quickly and abruptly under certain conditions. Actually, throughout history, people's decisions, influenced by money, have played a big role in leading to major political changes and developments. Let's start with some examples in order. A lot of people think the French Revolution, one of the most important events in human history, started with people fighting for their rights and storming the Bastille, the symbol of the royal regime. France was providing a lot of economic and military support to the Americans fighting against England in the American War of Independence, and that really hurt the French economy. Add to that the agricultural famines before 1789, and you've got a recipe for revolution. Since the start of the 18th century, the people had been paying for France's never-ending wars with poverty, and they were angry at the royal and noble classes and the church institutions with their big privileges and wealth. The change that the people wanted had happened, but it had gotten out of hand. When the revolution went off the rails, the Jacobins seized power, the Reign of Terror began, tens of thousands of people were guillotined, and the struggle against the new regime in regions such as Vendée cost hundreds of thousands of lives. After a bunch of different groups took turns running things, Napoleon Bonaparte, a young artillery general, first became a co-ruler and then took charge completely. The thing that made Bonaparte a big deal was his order to fire shrapnel made from iron balls loaded into cannons at the people rebelling against the Directory in Paris. This event, which English historians later dubbed a whiff of grape shot, paved the way for Napoleon. When Napoleon declared himself emperor, that marked the end of the French Revolution. When the Napoleonic Wars ended, France was in bad shape. They had lost millions of people, but the poverty of the people remained unchanged. Victor Hugo's Les Miserables shows what life was like during this time, and it's pretty rough. Meanwhile, after Bonaparte, the Bourbon dynasty, the former royal family that had fallen during the French Revolution, returned to power. The French Revolution caused a lot of death and poverty for the French people, but it made an intellectual contribution to human development that's unparalleled. The American War of Independence is also known as the 13 colonies fighting for independence to defend their rights and freedoms against the British Empire. This is a lovely fairy tale too. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, which some historians call the First World War, ended with England and its allies winning. This war, fought in North America, Europe, and India, involved all the major powers. Britain, Canada, and India, and other gains, came out on top. But by the end of the war, the British treasury was completely depleted. The royal administration decided to change the rules of trade with the colonies because they needed more money to replenish the treasury. Back then, the colonies sold raw materials and agricultural products to their respective kingdoms and bought processed and finished products from the mother country. They weren't allowed to trade with any other state outside the mother country. When the 13 colonies in America started having to pay extra taxes on the stuff they were sending to England, things got bad for the people living there. That's what started the War of Independence. George Washington, the war's leader, had a successful and distinguished career as a British colonel in the 7 Years' War. While the British colonists, or the Americans, fought against their former comrades in arms, France and Spain, with whom they had fought tooth and nail in North America 12 years earlier, now stood as allies alongside the Americans. When the war ended, the Americans set up a perfect and unique republic for the late 18th century, but for some reason they only gave the rights from this republic to white people of European descent. After the War of Independence, the U.S. kept using slave labor for raw materials and agricultural production. A republic that relied on slave labor solved its problems in its founding constitution 80 years later through a massive civil war as it industrialized. More Americans died in the American Civil War than in World War I and World War II combined. If we fast forward a bit further in history, we get to the revolutions of 1830 and 1848. These revolutions are what gave rise to today's political movements. They were a reaction against the Vienna system established after the Napoleonic Wars. The Vienna system protected Europe from total war, except for local conflicts, until World War I. Just as the French Revolution shook absolute monarchy in Europe and eliminated the last remnants of feudalism, the revolutions of 1830 and 1848 resulted in the working class and the bourgeoisie wiping out the system of absolute monarchy in Europe. The 1848 revolution introduced ideas like social democracy, socialism, and the rights of the working class. History can be a real tease sometimes. The revolution of 1848 overthrew the monarchy in France, and Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, one of the leaders of the revolution, became president. 4 years after becoming president, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, a Republican, staged a coup, changed the system, and transformed France into an imperial regime. In 1844, when he was 32, he wrote Extinction du Pauperisme, the elimination of poverty, which won him support from the lower and middle classes. This populist politician became Emperor Napoleon III in the coup of 1852. His adventurous foreign policy as emperor ended up costing France and his family a lot. The formation of a unified Germany was largely due to Napoleon III's lack of skill, as well as Bismarck's brilliance. The French people have elected Napoleon III, and then they found themselves at the end of their journey, with their country invaded, Paris under siege, and the Prussian king arriving at the Palace of Versailles to boldly claim the crown of the German Empire. The 1873 economic crisis, which began in the U.S., at the time a major economic power, is also known as the Long Depression. The panic that started in the financial markets spread to all sectors, creating a long period of deflation around the world. The lower and middle classes, especially the working class, were really hit by this crisis. One thing that happened during this time was the rise of nationalist movements. Even reasonable politicians and rulers couldn't stay indifferent to these movements. By the time the 1900s rolled around, communities were eager for a world order created by a great war, with the victors crushing the opposing side. When World War I began in 1914, lots of people gathered in the squares and celebrated the war. Unfortunately, 80% of the millions of people who boarded trains to the front lines after celebrating in the squares didn't live to see 1916. By 1917, soldiers were so tired of the war that they didn't want to fight and wouldn't follow orders to attack. World War I killed off a whole generation in Europe, left a lot of people disabled, and set off World War II because of all the trauma it caused. Even now, problems like the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the never-ending wars in the Middle East come from the lingering effects of World War I. The October Revolution of 1917, which turned the Russian Empire into the Soviet Union, was mostly based on the struggles of peasants and workers before and during World War I. In World War I, the Russian army lost over 9 million people, including around 2 million dead, 3.75 million wounded, and 3.5 million prisoners in battles like Tannenberg, the Masurian Lakes, Galicia, and the Brusilov offensive. They sent all the men they could get to the front, which made the already bad economy even worse. If there weren't any peasants to harvest crops or workers to make basic consumer goods, the cities would have starved. If the conditions hadn't been right, Lenin, who the Germans sent to Russia on a sealed train to cause trouble, probably wouldn't have been able to lead the revolution. Even worse, the fight of the communists in charge in the huge Russian Empire from 1918 to 1922 against the people who had overthrown the Tsarist supporters led to a tragic play that we rarely see in history. The Russian landscape, with its vastness, became a symbol of hardship, with many facing starvation and even exile. By 1920, Russia's national income had dropped to 1/6 of its pre-war 1913 level. Boris Pasternak's famous novel Dr. Zhivago did a great job of showing how big the disaster was. After the 1929 economic crisis hit, it was like a steamroller for the working and middle classes all over the world. It destroyed fragile economies and democracies in Europe. The people's choice was fascism, which was based on racist ideas. Politicians like Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, Franco in Spain, and Horthy in Hungary used the economic hardships and weaknesses of the people to their advantage. This set the stage for one of the worst disasters in human history, World War II. The German people followed Hitler to get back the territories that the Treaty of Versailles had taken away from their homeland. As a result, the country was devastated in World War II. Vital regions such as Silesia, Pomerania, and East Prussia were lost, and 6 million Germans died. Germany would be known as the place where the Holocaust happened, and that shame would stay with them for generations. After World War II, Winston Churchill, the hero of the war and the most visionary and strategic leader of the Allied powers, lost the elections exactly 2 months after the war ended in Europe and transitioned from prime minister to leader of the main opposition party. The British people voted for the Labour Party, which promised labor and social security reforms instead of Churchill, whom they saw as a war hero. Even though Churchill had a lot of support, at 83% in May 1945, when the war in Europe ended, the Labour Party still won the July elections with 48% of the vote. The British people ditched Churchill, who had put a country that had been devastated in France in 1940 and brought to the brink of defeat among the 3 major victorious powers, for the Labour Party program that promised to help the people and promote welfare. The Labour Party sped up the dissolution of the British Empire, and the position of Britain, which had emerged victorious from the war, became confusing. Well-established democracies have lots of ways to adapt and control leaders who got into power using populist rhetoric. Take the US president, for example. He's got a pretty important position in the system, but like in all strong democracies, there are a bunch of checks and balances to make sure he doesn't go off the rails. We've got the Supreme Court, an independent judiciary, the House and Senate party leaders keeping him in check, and the weight of the states in the federal system. We should remember that even though we elected George W. Bush twice in recent history, the system has somehow managed to work itself out. It even forced Nixon, a very successful president, to resign over Watergate, and created a president who is well remembered as a second-rate movie actor like Reagan and who dealt the final blow to the USSR. Trump's a politician who's made a lot of money and lost a lot of money, and he's also become a media star. If he was a regular politician, Trump's mistakes, his attitude, his love for women, and his tax problems would have stopped his rise. But because Trump positioned himself as a media star running for president, these weaknesses weren't as important to voters and even had a positive effect on his image. He's painted his opponent as a man who's part of the system, and he's positioned himself as the leader who'll bring about change. That's given him an edge over his opponent. Trump's election may not be a huge shock, but the fact that so many people are supporting him and similar figures could lead to some major changes. Popular movements and votes can be the start of change. But once change starts, it's hard to say where it'll lead.